All right, so thank you all for joining us for this afternoon or tonight's discussion, no matter where you are throughout the country and perhaps around the world. Before we welcome our moderator and guest speaker, we're going to show you a brief video to take us back to what happened in Charlottesville. And as you can imagine, it has some disturbing images and sounds.
Terror in Charlottesville.
Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote my car has ran into
Victims thrown in the air.
acting domestic terror.
Ten of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop the violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences. But we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
Wow, that was a powerful message just to get things started. And I want to welcome everyone. My name is Mohammed Fraser Rahim. I'm a Truman member and also an assistant professor in the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. Thank you for taking the time to join this Truman National Security Project event and Integrity First for America for this important and timely discussion on the anniversary of January 6th. Just for an overview and context, the Truman National Security Project is a 501c4 organization with a mission to unite and equip our diverse community of American leaders to produce timely, innovative, and principled solutions to complex national security challenges. Integrity First for America is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to holding those accountable who threaten long-standing principles of our democracy, including our country's commitment to civil rights and equal justice. Using the courts and the court of public opinion, IFA seeks to protect the integrity of American democracy by fighting back against efforts to dismantle the norms that keep the nation strong. So I start and situate us all. Exactly 1 year ago today, our nation witnessed a mob of supporters of the former president storming and breaching the United States Capitol, an intent on disrupting the congressional joint session that would formalize then President-elect Joseph R. Biden's victory in the 2020 presidential elections. For several hours, they assaulted members of the DC and Capitol Police and vandalized and occupied the seat of US democracy. They forced congressional staff and lawmakers to take cover and evacuate as the rest of the nation watched in horror and disbelief at what was unfolding. January 6th was not the first instance of domestic violent extremism that we saw in this country. In August of 2017, neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on Charlottesville, Virginia for a weekend of violence. This violence was no accident. Rather, it was the result of months of planning. And it previewed, the extremist terror that has followed, including the 2021 insurrection. Integrity First for America, in partnership with a world-class legal team, took on the individuals and hate groups at the center of this violent movement to court and won, securing multi-million-dollar damages and holding these extremists accountable for the violence they orchestrated. The urgency of combating white supremacy and violent extremism in America is evident, which makes IFA and Truman's work all the more critical. It is my honor to introduce my friends and two esteemed guests who discuss the path from Charlottesville to the Capitol and the impact of this landmark lawsuit as a model for accountability and its role in the fight against violent hate. My colleague Amy is a political partner with the Truman National Security Project and is also the executive director of Integrity First for America, the civil rights nonprofit that spearheaded the successful landmark lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. She has extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy, having worked for a number of federal, state, and local officials, campaigns, and advocacy organizations. Amy frequently appears in national media and has been awarded a number of fellowships and honors, including being named a Women in Power Fellow at the 92nd Street Y, and is a City and State 40 Under 40 Rising Star. My other colleague, Courtney, is a Truman political partner and co-head of the Truman National Security Project's Homeland Security and Community Resilience Group. She is also the CEO of CLB Global Strategies, with over 20 years of experience in the international political and business arena. She has worked in senior roles on behalf of the federal government, think tanks, and law enforcement agencies. She is a strategic advisor, thinker, published author, and speaker on national security, counter-extremism, culture, and hate around the world, specializing in strategic partnerships and building cross-cultural bridges. She is one of LA's 40 Under 40 2017 and has been featured on CNN, ABC, Al Jazeera, Euronews, This Hill, and Sky News Arabia, to name a few. Most recently, she had a 1-hour special on CNN with Lisa Ling, highlighting the changing face of terrorism and hate. So, and now, without further ado, I will hand it over to these inspiring women to get our fireside conversation started. Thank you as we all listen attentively.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mohammed. We've worked around the world together, and the national security space is so lucky to have your expertise. We are so delighted to have all of you joining us. What an important and poignant discussion to have as we mark the 1-year anniversary of the storming of the Capitol. I feel like this is a day that's been etched into our collective memory as a society, and certainly one that was very personal for many of us that work in the national security space. I'm inspired by my friend and my colleague, Amy Spitalnick, for working so tirelessly to combat extremism, and most recently for her victory in suing the neo-Nazis that were behind the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville back in 2017. This will be a conversation on what that victory in court means, as well as on hate and extremism and white supremacy and how it's evolved into the threat that we see today. So the plan is to take a deeper dive into the importance of justice and the role of accountability in confronting the threat of extremism. So Amy, let's go ahead and get started. Can you start our discussion today off by just giving us a brief refresher of what actually happened on that day in Charlottesville back in 2017?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Courtney, for moderating and pulling this together, and Mohammed and the whole Truman team. And it's particularly wonderful when IFA and Truman get to team up, because It's near, and both organizations are, of course, very near and dear to me personally. And I think when we think about our national security, I joined Truman 10 years ago as a partner. And when you think about national security then versus now, I truly believe there's no greater threat to our national security right now than the issues we're here to talk about: the rise of white supremacy and other forms of far-right domestic extremism that have become increasingly normalized and mainstreamed over the last few years. And so having this conversation with Truman on January 6th in the aftermath of our trial just really pulls together so many urgent themes and connections that I hope will continue to get the attention they deserve well beyond the anniversary of January 6th. But first, start to your question, it's easy to forget that 4 years ago, an American city came under siege by neo-Nazis and white supremacists who in many ways utilized the exact sort of tools and tactics we saw just a little over 3 years later on January 6th at the Capitol. That line from Charlottesville to the Capitol illustrates both the ways in which these tools and tactics are so prevalent, the cycle of white supremacist and extremist violence, and also I think the ways in which extremism has morphed and evolved and become increasingly normalized since then, which I know we'll dive into. But in August of 2017, I think many of us remember that visceral feeling watching Nazis with torches marching on the University of Virginia that night of Friday, August 11th, in which they walked through some of the most hallowed parts of the UVA grounds, intentionally walking past areas where students were living and faculty were living, called the Lawn, and eventually surrounded the Thomas Jefferson statue on campus, where they beat, punched, kicked, threw fuel and lit torches at a small group of peaceful counter-protesters, largely students who had gathered there that evening to peacefully protest white supremacists coming to town. Of course, the next day, we know how the day ended and the car attack that killed Heather Heyer and injured so many other people. But it was truly a day and a weekend of violence. These extremists had come to Charlottesville under the guise of protesting the removal of a Confederate monument. But as our lawsuit and the trial that we just held detailed, that was, of course, never the real goal. The real goal was violence. And so the day included these extremists marching on downtown, including surrounding the local synagogue with semi-automatic weapons, chanting things like Sieg Heil and talking about torching those Jewish monsters, included using these massive white vans to terrorize the Black neighborhoods in Charlottesville, which continued long after Unite the Right ended. And of course, it included multiple acts of violence against peaceful counter-protesters, charging a line of interfaith clergy, and ultimately, of course, James Fields driving his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer, injuring many others. Many of our plaintiffs were attacked both on Friday night, injured in the car attack, and in other incidents of violence throughout that weekend. And what our lawsuit detailed was that nothing that happened that weekend was an accident. Rather, it was planned meticulously in advance. Over the course of this case, we collected 5.3 terabytes, which is 5.3 million megabytes of evidence from social media chats, text messages, phone call logs, and even testimony of in-person events and conversations that illustrated how meticulously planned this all was, down to discussions of whether these extremists could hit protesters with cars and claim self-defense. They called this Unite the Right. They went there under the guise of protesting the removal of a Confederate monument, but internally, they referred to it as the Battle of Charlottesville and a racial holy war that they intended to bring to that community, specifically to target people based on their race, their religion, and their willingness to defend the rights of their neighbors. And so that's not an accident. That's not protected conduct. That's a violent, racist conspiracy. And we have laws that are meant to protect against it. And using those laws, we took to court the 24 individuals and groups most directly responsible. We held this trial in October and November. And on November 23rd, we had the jury come back with a verdict resoundingly in our plaintiff's favor.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the events of that day, and it's amazing how you guys got together and decided to take them to court. So thank you for shedding a light on what the trial was and actually the events of that day at the same time. So following the trial, which ended in November, your plaintiffs won a $26 million verdict. against the defendants. Can you help us understand what that verdict means and why it's so important and such an impactful outcome?
Absolutely. So we are, our plaintiffs are private citizens. We're a private civil rights organization. We don't have the ability to bring criminal charges, of course. Only the government can do that. But as private plaintiffs, there is a lot that we can do under our civil justice system, and those are precisely the tools that we used here. So we brought a case that alleged a conspiracy orchestrated by these defendants, as well as a number of other things, including racial, religious, and ethnic intimidation and harassment, and some other claims against James Fields in particular, who drove the car. And what happened with this verdict is that after a 4-week trial, every single defendant was found liable for a conspiracy. And the claims that were brought against a smaller subset against those racial and religious intimidation and harassment claims, every single defendant being held liable there was found liable by the jury, as well as, of course, James Fields for those additional claims. The jury was deadlocked on one federal conspiracy claim that we brought, but we did win the state conspiracy claim. And of course, as you mentioned, won an over $26 million verdict against all of these defendants. So we've also, even before trial, won default judgment against 7 other defendants, and that exact number will be determined at a later date. And this matters for so many reasons. I think first and foremost, it matters because there's been such a stunning lack of accountability in the aftermath of Charlottesville, and more broadly, if you look at the cycle of extremism. I think that's also true with January 6th, that even though there's been far more accountability there than there's been since Charlottesville. But just making clear that there will actually be accountability, that you can't participate in this sort of violent extremism and go without consequence, that it won't go unanswered. There's real value and power in that. Then, of course, there's the real financial and operational impacts a case like this can have. Even before trial, defendants like Richard Spencer, complaining that this case has fully financially devastated him, made sure that the alt-right was, quote, dead and buried, as he told the Washington Post the day of the verdict. Or other defendants talking about how this has precluded them from going about certain activities, from opening new buildings. Some said they refused to participate in subsequent events and potential acts of violence because they didn't want to be sued again. They wanted to, for example, hold a Charlottesville 3.0 in summer 2018, which was a big bust because of the accountability that they faced in this case. And of course, now that they're facing a $26 million judgment, we will effectively follow them around for the rest of their lives to the ends of the earth to collect on those judgments. However, we can, whether it be through seizing money directly, seizing assets, garnishing wages, putting liens on their homes. There are a lot of tools in the toolbox to collect on judgments like this. And we know that historically civil litigation has played a major role in bankrupting and dismantling these hate groups and their leaders for that reason. But I also think it matters for sort of more broader, perhaps less tangible, but equally important reasons. It matters first because our case, both the lawsuit itself and the 4-week trial, was really the only opportunity in which the full story of what happened in Charlottesville was told for the world to hear. And that's particularly important at a moment when extremists, especially white supremacists and other far-right extremists, are trying to rewrite history. They're trying to tell us that what we know to be true, that what many people of color and others in this country have experienced simply isn't true. And so getting the facts on the historical record, on the court record, having a jury affirm those facts by finding the defendants liable, there's incredible value in that. And I think that also applies, of course, to the cases that we're now seeing around January 6th and the work of the January 6th Commission. We can't let these extremists rewrite history. And one of the best ways to do that is to get the story and the facts on the record by holding those responsible accountable. It's also important because it helped open people's eyes to this crisis of extremism. I think we're living in a news cycle that moves on very quickly, but at the time of trial, we were really heartened by the attention it got. It was every hour of cable news on every primetime network, on the cover of most newspapers, including the Times and Washington Post and USA Today. And I say that not because I used to be a flack in my prior career, but because I think there's value in there being real light shed on how extremists operate and this crisis of extremism. And the last thing I'll say, the other reason why I think it's so important is what has been alluded to here, in that in the aftermath of our case, we've seen how it's really become a model for how you hold extremists accountable, particularly over the last few months, we've seen other civil lawsuits brought against those responsible for January 6th, including a new case brought by the DCAG just a few weeks ago. And he has specifically cited our lawsuit as the model for his case and creating momentum for these sorts of cases. And that's valuable because at a time when accountability and when justice has been in such short supply, having this sort of framework, having this model plays such an important role in ensuring that we actually seek that accountability and makes it a lot easier, not just for private entities, but now public officials like the DCAG to do so.
No, that accountability is so important, and your entire team should be applauded for the courage in bringing that case up and winning. You know, in that case, you heard testimony from everyone, from plaintiffs, from defendants. What stuck with you the most, or what maybe surprised you the most during that month-long trial in November?
Yeah, it was really a stunning 4 weeks. So I've been steeped in this case for years now, as has the whole team that's been working on it. And I should say we had an incredible legal team led by Karen Dunn, Robbie Kaplan, and others like Jeff Phillips and Mike Block and Alan Levine, and so many I wish I could shout out who've been working tirelessly on this case, who, much like me, I think, went into it thinking that nothing would shock us anymore. And sitting through those 4 weeks of trial, we still found ourselves shocked nearly every day. Shocked by defendants who used the N-word in their remarks to the jury or made Holocaust jokes on the stand. And in fact, one of the defense attorneys specifically said after the verdict that part of their strategy was to desensitize the jury to hate and extremism. And that stuck with me because that's part of the strategy we're seeing play out on a national level right now. When you have Tucker Carlson talking about white genocide replacement theory on primetime TV, when you have hate and extremism becoming such a normalized part of our discussion, as we saw on January 6th and so many other times since, it's part of a deliberate strategy to desensitize the country to hate and extremism, to make it normal, to make it palatable, and to make people feel like there's no use in standing up against it. And what was heartening is that the jury didn't buy it, no matter how these defendants tried to desensitize them to the worst of the worst when it comes to hate, anti-Semitism, racism, white supremacy. They didn't buy it, and they found the defendants liable. And that brought, I think, some hope to many of us. There's so much more to say about what happened in the trial. I'm sure it'll come up over the course of this conversation. And our IFA team did a great job summarizing each week of trial, which you can find on our website, in addition to other resources that we're going to continue to be uploading over the coming weeks, including court transcripts and all sorts of other things. And I encourage folks to check them out. The other highlight I'll share is that we brought a few expert witnesses to trial, folks that I actually suspect some here might know. First, Deborah Lipstadt, who some of you might know as the preeminent scholar on anti-Semitism in America. And I think in particular, it was important to us to explain to the jury why anti-Semitism was so central to what we saw at Unite the Right. This was a rally purportedly about a Confederate monument from white supremacists. Clearly, we knew that they were racist. But why did 80% of what they were talking about have to do with the Jews? And that's because of the underlying anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that really animate so much of white nationalism and white supremacy in America. This idea of Jews being the puppet masters, orchestrating the replacement of the white race through support for the Black community, brown community, immigrants, refugees, anyone who doesn't fit into the vile, narrow vision for what this country should be, according to the white supremacists. And having Deborah Lipstadt explain that was, I think, really powerful because it really made the jury understand why these defendants talked about things the way that they did, why anti-Semitism was so central. And of course, it was amazing to see these neo-Nazi defendants try to get Deborah Lipstadt to sort of like tell them that their Holocaust jokes were okay. They literally asked her, is there any Holocaust joke that's okay? To give you a sense of how insane some of these days of trial were. And then we also had Dr. Pete Sini, who worked in partnership with Dr. Kathy Blee, two incredible experts on white supremacy, who talked about the tools and the tactics these defendants use to create plausible deniability, which is to effectively ensure that, when they talk about hitting protesters with cars, they then caveat it by saying, oh, well, we're just joking. Or they have this idea of front stage, backstage, where they say certain things in public and other things when they don't think anyone's listening. Like Richard Spencer's vile anti-Semitic rant that was leaked out into the world and sort of contradicted the image of a polished suit and tie neo-Nazi that many had. And so having these experts explain that to the jury and sort of through the media covering the trial, the world, I think was really valuable, because many people, including the average American, have no idea that this is why these extremists operate the way they do and how deliberate of a strategy it is.
Yeah, you make such great points in that. One that stuck out of what you just said to all of us is how sort of watered down, and desensitized that we've become as a nation. We've seen so many of these incidences pop up, and there is a desensitizing that happens. But I think on the flip side of that, there is still a hope, because there is a heightened awareness and people are paying attention a little bit more, and trying to stop things in their own daily lives that are popping up, or if people say something, which we'll talk about later. Well, so transitioning now to what today means, the 1-year anniversary of the storming of the Capitol, we saw a violent insurrection in the halls of that Capitol 1 year ago today, that in many ways used the playbook of what you just referenced and what you just talked about that happened in Charlottesville. Amy, can you talk a little bit about some of the through lines between what you saw in Charlottesville those years ago and what we saw 1 year ago today at the Capitol?
Absolutely. And I think, please jump in as well, because I know that you have been closely following much of this, as others in the Truman community have. But what was shocking to me watching the events of January 6th unfold a year ago was how familiar it felt. Not just the fact that there was a violent attack on, in this case, the seat of our government, but as 4 years ago, it was a violent attack on an American city and college, but also, of course, many of the tools and tactics that they use. The fact that so much of it was planned online, much like Charlottesville was. In this case, the fact that so much of it was planned actually out in the open is even more disturbing, but a sign of how emboldened and normalized some of this has become. Of course, the use of free speech instruments, quote unquote, to violently attack people, literally just using flagpoles to beat people, as happened at Unite the Right and happened at the Capitol, as many of us know. Of course, the immediate finger pointing to Antifa, the boogeyman or red herring that is always used to distract and deflect from far right violence. And of course, there is zero evidence that Antifa had any presence or role whatsoever on January 6th. And much like the jury didn't buy the Antifa defense during our trial, I don't think that anyone's going to buy that here, even more so. And I think the ideology that we saw, this idea of stopping the steal of our country, it might not be Jews will not replace us, chanted by people carrying torches meant to evoke the Nazis. But at the end of the day, it harkens back to the very same conspiracies and ideas that if you are generally a white Christian, largely male man in this country, your country is being taken away from you by immigrants, refugees, and so on. And of course, there's always some sort of conspiracy responsible for that. Sometimes it's explicit, like it was at Unite the Right. Sometimes it's a bit more implicit, like it was with stopping the steal. And oftentimes, especially over the last year, it is being promoted in a very normalized way on Fox News each night by elected officials, by politicians, including people like Elise Stefanik and others who use it in their own campaign propaganda, or even government comments in their official capacity as government officials.
There's like a normalizing.
Exactly. And so the ways in which that was so central to the January 6th insurrection should frighten all of us. And the fact that it's become even more normalized since is really a terrifying sign of just how mainstream this extremism has become. I think what was different from Charlottesville to January 6th is that that period of time really illustrated how, because of that normalization, how this is far less major hate groups at this point, right? In Charlottesville, we were talking about major neo-Nazi groups, people like Richard Spencer and others. On January 6th, we were largely talking about your neighbor next door. And there were certainly hate groups and militias who were present there. Kathleen Ballou has a great piece in the Washington Post today talking about how we can't lose sight of the fact that there was this organized hate group presence. And of course, there are specific lawsuits being brought against groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and a number of individuals. But the fact that there were a number of people there who were really could have just been your neighbor next door who was radicalized on Facebook or on the Donald or whatever website they were reading their disinformation on is terrifying. There was this amazing but horrifying SNL skit a few months after the insurrection in which like a neighborhood group was having cocktails or a book party or something like that at someone's house, and the FBI kept knocking on the door to arrest 3 or 4 of them for participating in the insurrection. It was sadly illustrative of what we're talking about here, that more and more quote unquote normal people have been caught up in this diet of disinformation and extremism that has become increasingly normalized over the last few years. And that's why it makes accountability all the more crucial.
Well, and that accountability, I think, your lawsuit is part of that, right? How do you think that your lawsuit will serve as a model for litigation going forward for the insurrection, for white supremacist groups and individuals that were tied to January 6th?
One of the most heartening moments in this job has been actually seeing it become a model. I think it's hard to find hope in moments like these, right? It's hard to not feel like our democracy is falling apart, that literally all of that is at stake, because it is, right? We're talking about our democracy literally being at stake here. But I do draw hope from the fact that since January 6th, and particularly over the last few months, there have been cases brought explicitly modeled on ours. And most notably, in addition to cases brought by members of Congress and certain members of the Capitol Police, all using the same statute that we used. Just a few weeks ago, as I mentioned earlier, DC Attorney General Karl Racine brought a really important lawsuit on behalf of the district against the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and a number of individuals. This is the first time a government entity has done this, and I think that's important. I'm a strong believer in attorneys general and the roles that they can play. I used to work in the New York AG's office. I think Truman hosted a really great panel on this when I was there about how state AGs can really be on the front lines of fighting for our democracy. And I think that's true now, even in the Biden era, when we're perhaps fighting the federal government less, but still fighting for our democracy in many ways. And the fact that AG Racine has taken our lawsuit as a model to create his own case. He's done this in partnership actually with a few folks, including the States United for Democracy Center, where Truman and Katie Reister works, the EDL, and some pro bono counsel at Paul Weiss, which also did work on our case. So they have this incredible team working on that suit. And AG Racine has been talking quite extensively about how our case really was the model for this and created momentum. And if there's anything we hoped would come out of this beyond the win itself and the major judgments, this was it. And to see that happen is really just extraordinary. It's not a silver bullet, right? Civil litigation is so important. We know that it can bankrupt and dismantle these groups and these leaders and play a critical role at a time when accountability is needed, but it needs to be one of many tools in the toolbox. And so if we view it that way, it can really be quite powerful.
And it does. It takes a holistic approach. That's one of the facets to try to fight this. But again, kudos to all of you guys, because that was a big, courageous undertaking. So just a reminder to all of the participants, we will be taking some questions. So feel free to pop those into the Q&A section. Amy, what in terms of prevention, when you see that this extremist threat that we're talking about has really migrated from the fringes of society into the mainstream sort of conversation, we almost see it in the regular political discord and an everyday conversation almost at this point. What do you do at that point?
Yeah, look, I think there's so much that we can do. First, I think accountability and justice is crucial. And responding to events like this is important when they happen. I don't want to discount that importance. Charlottesville, January 6th, a variety of other acts of extremism. One of the ways extremism is becoming normalized is not just through these major front page grabbing events, but through smaller acts of extremism involving school boards and public health officials and election officials, and making sure that those extremists are being held accountable as well is equally important. And so accountability and justice matters, not just because of the importance of actually holding those perpetrators accountable, but the deterrent effect it can have on others, which we saw in our case and which I know we'll continue to see. But it can't stop there. Cynthia Miller Idris of American University had this phenomenal op-ed in the New York Times yesterday about the importance of really building resilience when it comes to extremism. We oftentimes approach this, and I think we're sort of falling into the trap, and I know that this is something you've been deeply steeped in, of approaching some of this the same way we approach terrorism after 9/11. And we can't fall into this trap. We need to be approaching domestic extremism and disinformation and radicalization from effectively a public health sort of whole of society approach. How do we stop this in the first place? How are we making sure disinformation isn't running rampant on all facets of people's consumption of media, which is of course happening? How do we make sure that people aren't going down that rabbit hole of extremism and radicalization in the first place? And if they do, what are the ways we can stop it along the way? There's a variety of different tools we can use. There have been programs from not just the organization that Dr. Miller Idris runs at American University, I think in partnership with SPLC, but ADL and Moonshot did an important project, which I think actually another Trumanite Ryan was involved in, and a variety of other pilots and programs that are trying to look at this question of resiliency, which is a deeply important one that I think has largely fallen by the wayside over the last few years. Education is also an important part of the resiliency question, is making sure that social media companies live up to their ethical obligations. There is no requirement for any social media company to give a platform to extremism, full stop, no matter what they say, no matter what any right-wing politician tells you. That is not what the First Amendment says. No private entity needs to give space to extremism. And we need to stop falling prey to that red herring. And so, of course, I'm a deep believer not just in the power of the federal government, but the state and local government levels to also take action here, including making sure that we're handling hate crimes in the same way, holistically, from that sort of public health, whole of society approach. And I just was fortunate to serve on the new Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg's transition team on the hate crimes committee, and I'm really excited for what he might do in that regard, in addition to all the other reforms he's bringing to that office. And I really hope that we start to look at extremism through that lens. We can't fall into the same traps we have for the last few decades.
Yeah, it really does have to be a whole of society approach, I think. And one of the questions I always like to ask in that regard, yes, we talk about the federal government and local and state and even the private sector companies, you know, the social media companies. But if you're just an average everyday person that does not work in this space like you and I, or for local government or the federal government, how can the average person that might be listening to this actually make a difference? What are things that they can do in their individual daily lives to try to combat the hate that we're seeing around us?
Well, I think being attuned to and clear-eyed about the normalization of extremism is so important, because this is happening in ways that most people might not even recognize without thinking about it for a little bit, right? The ways in which our public health officials are being threatened simply for doing their job as it relates to the pandemic, the ways in which you hear just general politicians who might not even be considered extreme talking about, you know, a George Soros conspiracy to bring migrants up through the southern border or support Black Lives Matter. All of these are just watered down versions of the same sort of extremism we've seen in the Capitol a year ago, in Charlottesville and beyond. And so being attuned to that, educating ourselves about that, and then calling it out when you see it, particularly holding your elected officials to account. And I think similarly holding them to account in terms of asking them what they're doing on this front, whether it be local officials when it comes to hate crimes, whether it be federal officials when it comes to the broader domestic extremism strategy we need, how we're handling this in a holistic way, as we've been talking about. And similarly, of course, supporting efforts, not just our lawsuit, not just all of the other organizations that I've mentioned here who have been doing really important work in the space, but I think local organizations that are doing that sort of resiliency work in communities around the country that help prevent the sort of hate crimes and lower level extremism, for lack of a better term, that ultimately might develop into something larger and even more horrific. And so thinking about how we can both, not just financially support those organizations, but work with them to really build on that sort of community resiliency that we know is so crucial to preventing radicalization and extremism in the first place. And that's something that all of us can do no matter the field we're in. If you work in business, if you work in education, if you work in politics, if you work in tech, those are all spaces where that is not just crucial, but I think will require your industry to play a central role.
That's so true. And just in your everyday life, if you see something, say something, stand up for people, call it out so that we try to combat that normalization that we're seeing. I'm going to kick it off to some of the Q&A because we do have a ton of questions that have come in for you. Amazing, our fireside chat speaker here. The first one I'll ask, someone is saying, I'm just shocked and gobsmacked by the desensitization strategy of the defense team that Amy mentioned. Do you feel in some form that this is being promulgated by various actors at the national level as well? If so, how and in what form?
100%. And Courtney, please feel free to jump in as well, because I know you've been following this. We see it from elected officials who think it's okay to use replacement theory in their day-to-day vocabulary. We see it from primetime news anchors like Tucker Carlson and other Fox News pundits. We see it, of course, on social media across the board. And it is a very deliberate strategy. Of course, we saw it from former President Trump in a variety of different ways and a number of people in his administration. And certainly the ways in which we've seen such a lack of accountability for January 6th is another way in which this is manifesting, right? The ways in which a year later, there are still countless Republicans who have not said that what happened on January 6th is unacceptable is just a way in which the normalization of extremism and hate is being normalized. And so being clear-eyed about that is so important. And it is, I think, a very deliberate strategy, not just by traditional white supremacists and hate groups, but increasingly, sadly, people you might consider more mainstream officials and organizations.
Someone asked another really good question too, that you mentioned the delineation between the civil charges and criminal charges. That do you think, or what is the word, that will the city of Charlottesville or some other entity in Virginia bring criminal charges at this point?
Yeah. So there have been a handful of small criminal charges brought in the aftermath of Unite the Right. I think many people know that James Fields, who drove the car, is in prison for life. There were a handful of assault charges brought against people like those who were responsible for beating DeAndre Harris in that parking garage, and Chris Cantwell, one of our defendants. But of course, there has not been a broader based criminal accountability here. The statute of limitations is not up yet. Typically, the way this works is that you get criminal cases first and then civil cases. There was a wealth of evidence that came out from our case that can only help potential criminal charges. So I will simply say that we hope that criminal prosecutors on a variety of levels are looking at what came out in our case and during this trial, and keeping an eye on the statute of limitations and taking the extensive evidence that we put out there to use in any potential investigations they might consider.
Yeah, I hope so. Another great question. The fragility of our democracy became very apparent during these horrific events. Is there a mobilizing effect on the population that's been disengaged or sort of apathetic, or will this remain the status quo or worse? And referencing a New York Times article yesterday about truth has its own authority. And I don't know if you saw that particular one, but do you think that this will sort of remain the status quo, the disengaged, apathetic sort of nature that we're seeing right now in our society?
Yeah, and I'm really curious what others think, because this is obviously a problem that extends beyond simply combating white supremacy and extremism as it relates. When we're talking about our democracy being fragile, it of course is not simply these extremists, but also the attack on voting rights, the failure to protect voting rights, which is another massive hurdle that we need to deal with right now, that's inextricably linked to this broader conversation that we're having. And of course, so many other conversations that are happening about the filibuster and so much else. And so I think in general, I remember a reporter called me as January 6th was unfolding. And I said, he asked me, like, should we be surprised? And I think I said, if you're surprised, you haven't been paying attention. Mm-hmm. And what I'm concerned about now is that it feels like even less people are paying attention in certain ways. It's easy to pay attention on January 6th when there's wall-to-wall coverage of the anniversary, when it's hard to avoid, when news outlets are giving it the attention it deserves. But like with Charlottesville, like with Pittsburgh and Poway and El Paso and so many other acts of extremism in recent years, the news cycle quickly moves on afterwards. And particularly this one, in a world where it's a lot easier to talk about, Trump's new social media site or whatever other thing is the shiny object that national media is going to talk about. And so I hope that in some ways January 6th was the closest thing we had to a wake-up call in that regard. I think people are more attuned than they were a year ago. But I also am deeply concerned that they are still not paying attention when the news cycle moves on, when their lives move on, understandably. And part of that is understandable, right? We're living in a global pandemic. People are concerned with, are their kids going to go to school? How am I going to pay for my health care? And so many other things that feel far more dire and imminent to their day-to-day lives. But all of that is directly tied up in our ability to live in a functioning democracy. And when that's at stake, it's important that we be clear-eyed about that threat and pay attention to it. And so I hope that our leaders, including, today, President Biden gave a really extraordinary speech. I hope that he puts teeth behind that speech with a new round of policy proposals that builds on the domestic extremism strategy he released last summer, and continues to particularly work on that resiliency and other sort of whole of society, whole of government approach we've been talking about here. And so it's not just on media, it's not just on our elected officials, it's on all of us to make sure that we're holding everyone's feet to the fire here. And I think Truman is uniquely positioned to do that as national security professionals, as people who are in oftentimes the top levels of so many industries that have crucial roles to play. And so we just need to keep the alarm bells ringing.
Oh. And those alarm bells, I think, are ringing in certain circles, but not in the whole of society, like you said. And I think there's also a massive political divide. And so people are in their own sort of echo chambers. And that probably contributes to some of the apathy when so many other things are happening in the world. Another great question, and this is one that I had for you as well. Given these dire circumstances, can you offer some sense of what might be down the road? Is this as bad as it gets, or should we think of the stakes as higher? And kind of along the lines of a question that I had with that was, what are we seeing now, I guess, in the larger fight against white supremacy, and what's happened since the insurrection? Is it as bad as it's going to get, or is it getting worse?
So I'm conflicted about this, because I think it really depends on how we continue to react, right? Like January 6th could be the moment that we actually said this is not acceptable, and we are going to make clear that this is not what we want this country to be. It is what the country currently is. Everyone who says this is not what our country is has not been paying attention to American society and government and politics for a long time. This is who we are right now. And the question is whether we say that this is not what we want to be and we fix it, or we continue down the path where we're on. And if it's the latter, I think it gets much worse. I think we have an election this year. We have an election in 2 years that could very well involve extensive attempts by effectively authoritarian figures to steal elections. Everything that the far right accuses President Biden and the left of is what I'm deeply worried about them actually doing. And all of that happens by our failure to address voting rights, by our failure to address the normalization of attacks on election officials and other government officials. And until we do that with seriousness, I think it's only going to get worse. I don't want to be all doom and gloom, though. I think there are reasons for hope. I think Vanity Fair just came out with a lovely little piece about our case and these January 6th lawsuits that have followed. And I think I don't think I realized this was on record when I said it, but I'm fine with it being on record. I told the reporter that my mantra for 2022 is marginal hope, which is that I think that there are reasons to be hopeful. Of course, our win in Charlottesville told me that when people are forced to pay attention, in that case, a jury had to sit through weeks of this trial and understand the extremism that we were telling them was a very real threat. They found in our favor. They said that this has no place in our society and there should be consequences. And that gives me hope. And the fact that there are now these other cases coming out that are modeled on that gives me hope. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and people oftentimes ask me about that in the context of this work. And I think it's really easy to try to draw parallels to those dark times in our history, but there's a major difference in that we live in a country that still has a rule of law, that still has these institutions. And while we are going to have to fight like crazy to protect them in the coming months and years, we can still use them like we are here. And like many people are around the country running for office and standing up against these attacks on our democracy, not just on the federal level, but on the local and state level, which is so important, in some ways, even far more important than on the federal level. And so I do have a little bit of hope. And I think, again, if there ever was a crew well positioned to do this in a variety of ways, it's certainly the Truman crew.
I mean, just taking a little bit granular, though, after the insurrection, we did see sort of a slowdown, or I think maybe a paranoia, I guess is a good way to call it, for a couple of months, where a lot of these groups tried to regroup, rebrand, re-strategize, but that has picked back up. It might just look different. Can you talk a little bit about, because the threat is not gone, it is still here, it's just morphed and changed a little bit, right?
I think that's right. I think the threat has certainly morphed and changed, not just in the 4 years since Charlottesville, but in the 1 year since the insurrection. We've seen groups try to rebrand, try to reincorporate. In our lawsuit, they tried to do it, and we, of course, did not let them do that. For example, groups like National Socialist Movement or Identity Europa, which tried to rebrand and reincorporate. Of course, there are groups like the Proud Boys, which have done this very deliberately over the last year or so since the insurrection, but they are, of course, now still being held accountable through, for example, this new DCAG lawsuit and other lawsuits. And I think more broadly, what this speaks to is how extremism continues to become less hate groups in the traditional sense, right? Decades ago, we were talking about Klansmen and white hoods in the woods somewhere. A few years ago, we were talking about neo-Nazis connecting over Discord servers and descending on Charlottesville. With January 6th, it was a combination of some militia and hate groups coming together like that, but also a number of everyday Americans, as we talked about earlier. And I think we're going to increasingly move in that direction, which means that our strategies need to shift. You can, of course, use civil litigation against individuals. We did in our case. The DCAG is doing in his case, in addition to the hate groups. But it also means that so many of those other strategies we've been talking about are so much more important. And so being aware of that, being clear-eyed about that is so crucial.
Well, we saw what you just said exactly with even Al-Qaeda and ISIS, right? Going away from sort of the cell-based attacks into the being inspired by, in the basement of your grandma's house and going out and taking action, right? So as these groups morph and change, so do our tactics, as you just stated. I think last question, we'll sort of wrap up here, but from the audience, in your role, have you faced pushback or other challenges for prosecuting these cases?
Honestly, I think I faced more skepticism than pushback. I think certainly the defendants tried to claim that there were First Amendment issues here. And one of the most important things we did was not just in trial, but more broadly, make clear that this is not a question of the First Amendment. That's a defense that you hear not just from neo-Nazi defendants in our lawsuit, but from President Trump and right-wing extremists on social media who like to think that they have the luxury of saying anything they want anywhere to plan and promote violence without consequence, without deplatforming, or without, of course, accountability if they are part of a violent conspiracy, which is what happened at Unite the Right. And so if they had simply gone to Charlottesville and stood on the street corner with their signs and their chants, that would have been First Amendment protected activity. But that's not what they did. They went with a plan for there to be violence. They engaged in that violence, and then they celebrated that violence. And similarly, I think that's what we're seeing obviously over and over again when it comes to January 6th and so many of these other acts of violence. What's happening is not First Amendment protected conduct when you're attacking or terrorizing people in their place of work, school board meetings, or whatever it might be. And having the support of, for example, the former president of the number of former ACLU presidents who have written strongly in support of our lawsuit, and others, in addition to, of course, the jury agreeing with us and finding that the First Amendment defense didn't work for the defendants, is important on that front. I think, of course, there was a lot of skepticism. Part of my job was to just fundraise for this extensively, which has not been my favorite part of this work. I don't think anyone who has to ask for money likes doing it. But I think particularly at the beginning, there was deep skepticism about whether litigation would be effective and whether we could win. It was a novel legal strategy, and most people in the anti-extremism and anti-Semitism or anti-racism space haven't really thought about litigation as a crucial strategy. And I think what we got people to see even before trial, as defendants like Richard Spencer and others talked about the very real financial and operational impacts on them, was that litigation works, accountability works. Certainly we've been so lucky to have a number of supporters from across the country, including major institutional funders who have recognized that strategy. And I think that is a shift from where we were 3 or 4 years ago. The fact that I understand that skepticism. I too, when I was approached to be a part of this effort, I was excited about it, but I also was a little skeptical. And seeing that accountability works, that litigation works, that it could be such a crucial tool in the toolbox at a time when it's desperately needed, should hopefully give everyone a little bit of hope and remind us all that there are tools we can use to fight back at a moment like this.
We need that hope for sure. Closing it out, just very quick last question. What keeps you up at night right now?
The normalization of extremism, the way in which it's become so commonplace. There was a Times article, I think it was on the front page on Thanksgiving, that sort of looked, we worked with them on this. It was on the aftermath of our trial, Charlottesville plaintiffs win, replacement theory lives on. And that's what keeps me up at night. The fact that we can't just be responsive like we were in this case. We need to go after the root of these problems, which is the ways in which extremism and radicalization happen in the first place and become such a normalized part of our discourse. And that means not just Fox News, not just social media, but working on a whole of society level with tech companies and education and so much more. And I worry that we are not there. I hope that we will get there, that January 6th and these other acts of extremism will be that wake-up call as we need them to be, and that we'll have the leadership that gets us there. But if anything keeps me up at night, I would say it's that.
Keeps me up at night too. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, Mohammed, for opening us up here. And we thank you for all of your hard work in making this world a better place. And thank you to both organizations for hosting this event today, and to everyone who joined in. Thank you so much for participating and for your thoughtful questions. We appreciate your support, and we hope that you've learned something today, and that we all continue to be involved in the fight against extremism of all kinds. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye.